The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1873, carried by a postal rider whose horse was half dead from hard riding, and it contained nothing more than a name: Micah Wells, Coldwater Creek, New Mexico Territory, scrawled in handwriting that Abigail Bristol recognized as her dying father's last great effort upon this earth. She stood in the doorway of the small house on the outskirts of Abilene, Kansas, her dark hair unpinned from the night before, her cotton nightgown still on, and she read that name 3 times before the full weight of what her father had done settled into her bones. He had not left her money. He had not left her the small parcel of land she had hoped might sustain her. He had left her a name, an address, and a sealed note that explained in his neat, careful sentences that Micah Wells was an honest man, a good man, a man who had served alongside her father in the late war and had saved his life at Chickamauga at great personal cost, and that if there was one soul on God's green earth her father trusted to look after his daughter when he was gone, it was that man. Abigail's father, Thomas Bristol, had passed 3 days before the letter reached her. The neighbor woman, Mrs. Hatch, had sent word herself via a different rider, and that news had arrived first, which meant Abigail had spent 3 days in quiet, hollow grief before the letter gave that grief a direction to travel. She was 24 years old, newly alone in the world, with $12.40 to her name, a trunk of belongings, and an almost unreasonable amount of stubborn will. She had no siblings. Her mother had passed of fever when Abigail was 11. The house she stood in belonged to the landlord, Mr. Ferris, and she had 2 weeks before he would want it back. She folded the letter, tucked it into the pocket of her dress once she had changed out of her nightgown, and began to think. The sensible thing, her neighbors would have said, was to find work in Abilene. There was laundry to be done, homes to be kept, and a few respectable establishments where a woman of her education might find a position teaching children their letters. Abigail had taught school for 2 years already, and the schoolmaster, Mr. Dunn, had offered her a permanent position just last autumn. She could stay. She could make a modest, quiet life for herself here in Abilene, where the cattle drive still thundered through every summer, and the town smelled perpetually of dust and livestock and ambition. But she read her father's letter again that night by the light of an oil lamp, and she felt something tighten in her chest that was not grief, but something closer to certainty. Her father had been the most careful man she had ever known. He did not give compliments without reason. He did not point toward anything without having thought it through. And so the fact that he had spent his last available strength writing the name Micah Wells told her something she could not dismiss with practicality. She was going to New Mexico Territory. She gave herself exactly 4 days to prepare. She sold what furniture she could to neighbors who wanted it and got fair prices because she was firm about them. She packed her trunk with the essentials: 2 dresses, her father's Bible, her school reader, a warm blanket, a change of undergarments, her mother's silver comb, and a small photograph of her parents taken at a traveling photographer's studio in 1861, just before her father left for the war. She took the $12.40 and went to the stage office. The man behind the counter at the stage office, a heavy-set fellow named Pollock who wore his mustache like a personal advertisement, told her the journey to Coldwater Creek was not possible by direct stage. She would need to take the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe line as far as La Junta in Colorado Territory, then stage southwest through Raton Pass into New Mexico Territory, pick up another stage at Springer, and from there she could arrange private transport or ride another leg to Coldwater Creek, which was a small settlement a day's ride east of Santa Fe. Pollock had not even finished explaining when Abigail began calculating. She counted her money against the fares he quoted, asked about the cheapest possible travel, and determined that she could just barely make it with $2 left over if she was careful about food and did not pay for accommodations where she could avoid it. "That's a long journey for a woman traveling alone," Pollock said, not unkindly. "I am aware of the distance," Abigail said. "I would like to purchase a ticket to La Junta, please." He sold her the ticket. The train departed 2 days later, on a Thursday morning in late April, when the Kansas plains were just beginning to turn green, and the sky was the particular shade of blue that made the earth seem very large and very honest. Abigail sat in the passenger car with her trunk stowed above her, her hands folded in her lap, and watched Abilene disappear behind her without crying. She had already done her crying in private. Now was for moving forward. She had the letter in her pocket. She had pulled it out so many times in those preparation days that the fold lines were beginning to soften, the paper going tender at the creases. She knew the words by heart now, but she read them again on the train anyway, because reading them felt like hearing her father's voice, and she needed that more than she would have admitted to anyone. Her father wrote, "I know you are strong enough to make this journey, Abigail. You have always been stronger than you believed yourself to be. Micah Wells is a man of deep character. He helped me when I could not help myself, and he asked nothing in return. Whatever help he can offer you, take it without shame, because he will give it freely. He is stationed near Coldwater Creek, working his own land now. Tell him Thomas Bristol sent you. That will be enough. That will be enough." Those 4 words were what had made her decision final. The train ride to La Junta took 2 full days and involved a connection at Pueblo that required a 3-hour wait at a station platform, where the wind blew grit into everything, and a traveling salesman tried twice to engage her in conversation she did not want. She was polite but brief, and eventually he moved away to find a more willing audience. At La Junta, she found the stage station and bought her passage south through Raton Pass. The coach was crowded, a mining company representative heading to Santa Fe, a Mexican family returning home after business in Colorado, and an older woman named Mrs. Dunforth who was going to visit her son in Taos. Mrs. Dunforth, who had made this journey before, took one look at Abigail and seemed to decide immediately that the younger woman needed looking after. She shared her food at the stops, warned Abigail which water barrels were clean and which were questionable, and told her in great detail about the high desert landscape they were entering as they crossed through the pass. Raton Pass was the first moment the West showed Abigail its full, staggering face. The mountains rose around the coach road with a grandeur that was almost aggressive, enormous and dark with pine. The sky above them a hard, clear blue with no apology in it whatsoever. Abigail pressed her face toward the small window of the coach and felt something open up in her chest, something that was not quite wonder and not quite fear but was made of both in equal measure. "First time through the pass?" Mrs. Dunforth asked, watching her. "First time west of Kansas," Abigail admitted. The older woman smiled. "It gets you. Every time, even when you have seen it before, it gets you." They descended into New Mexico territory on the second afternoon of the stage journey, the landscape shifting from mountain pine to a broader, redder country where the mesas stood like patient elders on the horizon, and the sagebrush stretched in every direction with a kind of quiet authority. The air was different here, thinner, drier, carrying in it the smell of juniper and something mineral, and ancient that Abigail had no word for. It smelled like a different world. Springer was a small town with a wide, unpaved main street, a general store, a saloon, a land office, a livery, and a collection of adobe and wood frame buildings that looked like they were still deciding whether to stay or go. Abigail arrived there with 4 days of travel behind her, dust in her hair, her back aching from the hard coach bench, and her resolve entirely intact. She needed to find transportation to Coldwater Creek, which Pollock back in Abilene had described as being roughly another day's travel. At the general store, she asked the proprietor, a lean man named Garrett with reading spectacles pushed up on his forehead, if he knew of anyone heading toward Coldwater Creek. Garrett scratched his chin. "There's a freighter who runs supplies out to the smaller settlements every couple of weeks. Fellow named Cal Ruiz. He was loading up yesterday, so he might still be in town. Try the livery." At the livery, she found Cal Ruiz, a compact, weathered man in his 50s with a mustache as broad as his shoulders, overseeing the loading of 2 large wagons with barrels and crates. She explained her situation plainly. She was heading to Coldwater Creek to see a man named Micah Wells. She had very little money left but would be glad to work during the journey, helping with whatever needed doing along the route. Ruiz looked her over with the evaluating but not unkind gaze of a man who had been on the road long enough to recognize honest desperation. "You cook?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "My cook quit in Springer on account of he found gold in the hills, or believed he did, which is close enough to the same thing out here." Ruiz wiped his hands on a cloth. "You ride with me to Coldwater Creek, you cook and help manage camp, I take you for free. Deal?" "Deal," she said, and shook his hand before he could change his mind. The freighter's route was not the most direct path to Coldwater Creek, because Ruiz had 3 other stops to make before arriving there. But it was transportation, and it was honest work, and Abigail Bristol had never once in her life been too proud for honest work. She cooked beans and salt pork over fires built in the open desert. She helped with inventory at the supply stops. She kept the camp organized. And in the evenings when Ruiz and his young driver, a quiet boy of 19 named Tomás, sat talking in Spanish by the fire, she would sit apart with her father's Bible and read, or sometimes just look out at the desert sky. The sky at night in New Mexico territory was unlike anything she had seen before. It was not the wide sky of Kansas, which had always felt horizontal and boundless. This sky had depth. It seemed to go down as much as it went up, as if the stars were not above her but all around her, and the darkness between them was a living thing. She would sit looking up at it and feel very small and very sure that she was doing the right thing, which was a strange combination, but the desert seemed to produce strange combinations in a person. On the 3rd day of travel with Ruiz, she had grown comfortable enough to ask him a question that had been sitting with her since she started. "Do you know Micah Wells, the man at Coldwater Creek?" Ruiz was quiet for a moment, adjusting the reins in his hands as the wagon rolled through a dry wash. "I know of him. I deliver to his settlement sometimes. He has a ranch, not a big one, but solid. He keeps to himself mostly. People who know him respect him." He paused. "He is a quiet man, but not the kind of quiet that comes from weakness, more the kind that comes from not wanting to waste words." Abigail thought about that. "Is he a kind man?" Ruiz considered. "He is a fair man. I have seen him be kind. Last winter, when there was sickness in the Mexican settlement to the south of his place, he brought supplies. Did not talk about it. Just brought them." He looked at her sideways. "You have never met him?" "No," she said. "But you are traveling all this way to find him." "My father sent me," she said, and left it at that, and Ruiz, who was a man of intuition as much as practicality, asked nothing more. On a late afternoon in early May, with the sun going down over the western mesas in shades of orange and deep rose that seemed almost theatrical in their beauty, Cal Ruiz's freight wagon rolled into Coldwater Creek. The settlement was larger than she had expected and smaller than she had hoped. It had a main street, a general store that doubled as the post office, a blacksmith, a small church with a crooked cross on its roof, a saloon, and perhaps 30 or 40 buildings scattered around a central area where a creek, narrow but real, which seemed in this dry country like a kind of miracle, ran through a line of cottonwood trees. Children were playing near the creek, and a woman was hanging laundry on a line between 2 of the cottonwoods, and smoke was rising from the blacksmith's chimney. And it looked, in the particular gold light of the desert evening, like something a painter might have made up but decided was too perfect, and painted it anyway. Ruiz pulled the wagon up before the general store and climbed down with the ease of a man who had dismounted from wagons 10,000 times. "Wells has a ranch about 2 miles north," he said, pointing. "Follow the creek road. You will see a gate with the Wells name on it." He paused, looking at her with something that might have been fatherly concern. "It is late in the day. You are welcome to sleep in the wagon tonight and go in the morning when it is proper." Abigail looked north along the creek road, where the cottonwood trees made a pale green corridor in the fading light. She had come 600 miles on a name. She could wait until morning. Logically, she should wait until morning because arriving at a stranger's ranch at dusk was not the behavior of a woman of good sense. She picked up her travel bag, which she had carried separate from her trunk for the last leg, and looked at Ruiz. "Thank you," she said, "for everything. You have been more than generous." He understood immediately. He shook his head, but he was smiling. "You are going now." "I am going now," she agreed. "You are a stubborn woman," he said, with admiration rather than criticism. "I am a determined woman," she corrected, and started north along the creek road. The walk took 30 minutes. The evening was cooling fast, the way it always did in the high desert, and the air smelled of sage and creek water, and the dry, warm scent of cottonwood leaves just beginning to come fully in. She could hear the creek beside the road, a sound so gentle and continuous that it felt like company, and she was grateful for it because the silence of the desert at dusk was otherwise total and vast. She saw the gate before she saw the house, a simple wooden arch with the name WELLS burned into the crosspiece, the letters plain and deliberate, not decorative. Beyond the gate, a dirt track led through a fence line toward a house that was low and broad, adobe with a wooden porch along the front, a barn to one side that was larger than the house and in better repair, and a corral where 3 horses stood in the early dark, heads down, settled for the evening. Abigail stood at the gate for a moment. She had rehearsed this in her head during the long days of travel, what she would say, how she would explain herself. She had composed and discarded a dozen versions of the introduction. Now, standing at the gate in the violet desert dusk, all of her prepared words seemed entirely beside the point. She opened the gate and walked up the track toward the house. A dog appeared first, a big, rust-colored animal of mixed breed who came around the corner of the barn at a trot and stopped 10 feet from her, head up, assessing. He did not bark. He just looked at her with a seriousness that she found oddly respectful. "Hello," she said to the dog. The dog wagged his tail once, a single decisive wag, and then turned and walked toward the porch as if indicating she should follow. She did. She stepped up onto the porch, raised her hand to knock at the door, and at that exact moment the door opened. The man who stood in the doorway was perhaps in his late 20s. She would learn later that he was 29, and he was tall enough that he had to angle his head slightly to clear the door frame, though he did so without thinking about it, the way a man does when a door frame has been too low for him for long enough that ducking is just how he enters rooms. He had dark hair that was a little too long and pushed back from a face that was angular and weathered and possessed of a kind of steady, unhurried attention in its expression that reminded her immediately and disarmingly of what Ruiz had said, not the silence of weakness, but the silence of a man who did not want to waste words. He was holding a tin cup, steam rising from it. He had clearly just made coffee and been heading for the porch to drink it, and he had opened the door to find a woman standing on his porch in the near dark, which should have startled him but apparently did not, because the expression on his face was more curious than alarmed. He looked at her for a moment. She looked at him. "Micah Wells," she said. "Yes," he said, in a voice that was quiet and measured, the kind of voice that did not need to be loud to be heard. "My name is Abigail Bristol," she said. "My father was Thomas Bristol. He told me to find you." Something moved through his face at the name, not pain exactly, but the shadow of pain, quickly controlled. He looked at her more carefully now, reassessing something. "Thomas is," he stopped. "He passed," she said, 3 weeks ago." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Come inside," and stepped back from the door to let her pass, because Micah Wells, whatever else he was a man who had been raised to not let a woman stand in the cold of a desert evening when she could be sitting down with a cup of coffee. The inside of the house was simple, in a way that was clearly the product of a deliberate mind, rather than neglect. The main room had a stone fireplace with a fire burning low, a table with 2 chairs, a shelf of books that surprised her in its size, perhaps 40 volumes, which in this place was a small library, a braided rug on the dirt floor, and a kerosene lamp on the table that cast the room in warm gold. A second door led to what she assumed were sleeping quarters. The kitchen area was part of the main room, with a cast-iron stove and shelves of supplies arranged with the careful organization of a man who lived alone and had learned to keep things ordered as a form of company. He poured her a cup of coffee from the pot on the stove and set it on the table and gestured for her to sit. He sat across from her and set his own cup down, and he was quiet while she settled herself, unwinding the shawl from her shoulders and tucking it into her lap, and she understood that he was giving her time to begin when she was ready. She told him everything. She told him about the letter arriving after the news of her father's death, about the name and the note her father had left, about Abigail and the decision she had made and the journey she had taken. She told him plainly and without embellishment, because she sensed that embellishment would not be received as well as directness, and she was right. He listened to all of it without interrupting, his eyes on her face, his hands wrapped around his cup. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment longer. Then he said, "Your father saved my life in the war. The other way around, I mean. I know what he wrote, but if either of us owed the other a debt, it was me." He paused. "He wrote to me too about 2 months ago. He said he had a daughter he worried for, and he said he wished he could do more for her than he had. He did not ask me anything. He was just writing the way he wrote, I think, because he needed to say it out loud to someone." Abigail's throat tightened. She kept it from showing in her face mostly. "Did you write back?" "I did. I told him his daughter was welcome here whenever she needed. I told him I owed him more than I could repay." He looked at her directly. "I meant it." She nodded. "I want to be very clear," she said, because she was a woman who believed in clarity, especially in difficult situations. "I did not come here to impose on you. I did not come here to be a burden. I came because my father trusted you, and I trust his judgment, and I needed somewhere to go while I figure out what comes next. I am willing to work. I have been working my whole life. I am a school teacher by training. I can cook and clean and manage a household. I do not require charity. I require time and perhaps a roof for a short while, and in return I will do whatever is useful." Micah Wells looked at her across the table. The firelight was on his face, and in it she could see that he was weighing her, not unkindly but seriously, the way a person weighs something when they understand that what they decide matters. "The schoolhouse in Coldwater Creek has been without a teacher for 6 months, he said at last. "The town council has been writing to the territorial education office trying to get someone placed here. If you are a trained teacher, they would likely jump at the chance." He looked at his cup for a moment and then back at her. "In the meantime, there is a small room at the back of this house that is empty. It is not much, but it is private and clean. You are welcome to it for as long as you need." She looked at him. He looked at her. Between them in the warm light, something entirely simple and honest passed, the recognition of two people who were going to be all right with each other. "Thank you, Micah Wells," she said. "You are welcome, Abigail Bristol," he said. He made supper dried beans he had soaking, reheated with salt pork and green chilies that he kept in a ceramic pot, and added to nearly everything. She would discover, because he had come to love the flavor of the country he lived in. He heated cornbread that had been baked that morning. He set the table with 2 plates and no ceremony, and they ate across from each other while the fire burned down and the desert night pressed against the windows, and the conversation was neither awkward nor falsely easy. It was simply 2 people eating, asking the questions that made sense to ask, answering honestly when asked. She learned that he had come to New Mexico Territory in 1869, 4 years before, after spending some years after the war drifting through Kansas and Colorado, doing ranch work and freighting. He had claimed land near Coldwater Creek under the Homestead Act, built the house himself and the barn with help from neighbors, and had been working it since. He ran a modest cattle operation, sold beef to the supply depot at Fort Union and occasionally to the mining settlements to the north, and made enough to sustain the ranch, though not much more than that. He had no family living. His mother had died during the war, his father before it, and he had been an only child. He had some cousins in Virginia he had not been in contact with in years. He was alone in a way that was clearly a chosen state rather than an imposed one, or perhaps it had begun as imposed and simply become familiar, in the way that isolation sometimes does. She told him about her years teaching in Abilene, about her students, about the way she had loved the work even when it was difficult, which it often was. She told him about her father's stories of the war which she had grown up with, and somewhere in that telling she saw Micah Wells's face do something complicated and quiet, the way a face does when it hears a familiar name spoken by someone who loved the person it belonged to. "He talked about you," she said. "Not often, but he did. He said you were the best shot he had ever seen. He said you never complained about the mud." The corner of Micah's mouth moved. "The mud," he said, and for a moment something like a rueful smile was there. There was a considerable amount of mud. He said the mud was the worst part. It was, he agreed, worse than the cold, worse than almost anything. It was an unexpected intimacy, the sharing of a dead man's memories, two people who had loved the same person in different ways discovering that the love was real because they both felt the particular, specific ache of the details. It was not grief they were sharing so much as the proof of Thomas Bristol's reality, and it brought them both closer to each other than an introduction should have been able to do. She slept in the small back room that night on a narrow cot with a wool blanket over her. Her trunk not yet arrived from Springer. Ruiz had agreed to bring it when he came through in a few days, and she lay in the dark of an unfamiliar room in an unfamiliar land and felt, to her own genuine surprise, entirely at peace. The following morning she woke before first light to the sound of Micah moving in the kitchen, building up the stove. She dressed quickly and came out to help, and he turned from the stove with mild surprise but no objection, and she took over the biscuit making while he went to tend the horses, and by the time the sun was fully over the eastern mesa, there was a breakfast on the table that was better than either of them had eaten in some time. He looked at her over the biscuits with an expression she was beginning to learn, a kind of quiet acknowledgement that communicated appreciation without making a performance of it. He took her into Coldwater Creek that morning in the wagon, and he introduced her to the town council, which in this case was 3 men who happened to all be present at the general store at the same time, which was apparently how most things in Coldwater Creek got decided. The men were the store owner, a sharp-eyed man named Beaumont, the blacksmith, a large, good-natured man named August Schraber who had come from Germany 15 years ago and still spoke with a marked accent, and the minister of the small church, Reverend Okafor, a dignified man of Nigerian descent who had come to New Mexico territory by a long and complicated route he was willing to discuss at great length if given the opportunity. Micah introduced Abigail as a trained schoolteacher from Abilene, Thomas Bristol's daughter, and a person he was personally willing to vouch for. The 3 men looked at her with varying degrees of assessment, and then, almost comically in unison, all began talking about the schoolhouse problem. The schoolhouse was vacant. The children were running wild. This was how Schraber put it, with his broad hands making an expansive gesture that suggested the children of Coldwater Creek had achieved a kind of freedom he personally found alarming. There were 12 children of school age in the settlement and the surrounding ranches, and none of them had received proper instruction in 6 months. "I would be glad to begin immediately," Abigail said, "provided the schoolhouse is in usable condition and there are sufficient books and slates." There was a brief, slightly evasive pause among the 3 men. "Sufficient might be a generous word," Beaumont said. The schoolhouse was a single-room adobe structure on the east end of the settlement's main street. It had a wood stove that functioned, 12 small desks that had been made by Schraber himself and were solid if not elegant, a large board of blackened wood that served as a chalkboard, and approximately 4 books. She stood in the middle of it and looked around with the particular expression of a woman who has decided that limitations are simply the starting point for work. "I will need chalk, paper, and pencils at a minimum," she said. "And more books as soon as they can be obtained. I know there is a bookseller in Santa Fe. I can write to them." The council agreed to all of it, agreed to her salary, which was not generous but was honest, and agreed that she could start as soon as the school was prepared. The salary, she noted with private relief, would be enough for her to pay Micah a modest rent, which she intended to do whether he wanted her to or not. He did not want her to. They had that conversation on the ride back to the ranch, with the desert spreading around them golden and enormous in the midday sun. He said room and board were not a thing he required payment for, especially not from the daughter of Thomas Bristol. She said she was not the daughter of Thomas Bristol here. She was Abigail Bristol, who had a salary coming and who paid her own way wherever possible. They argued about it in the polite but absolutely immovable way of two people who are both stubborn in essentially the same direction, and ultimately compromised on a sum that was small enough for her to not feel she was drowning him and large enough for her to feel she was not a charity case. She had been in Coldwater Creek for 1 week when her trunk arrived with Ruiz's next delivery, and she had already begun teaching school. 8 of the 12 children had shown up on the first day. The others arrived over the following week as word traveled to the outlying ranches, and she had established order, routines, and a classroom culture with the efficiency of someone who genuinely loved the work and was good at it. She wrote to the bookseller in Santa Fe and received a shipment of readers, a geography book, an arithmetic text, and because she had included a personal note explaining the situation with what she privately thought was a fine balance of appeal and factual urgency. 2 novels thrown in for no charge, which she put on the shelf as rewards for excellent work, and around which the older students immediately began a competitive campaign of good behavior. Micah watched all of this with the attentive quietness that was his natural manner. He would ask her in the evenings how the day had gone, and she would tell him about the particular child who was struggling with reading but had an extraordinary grasp of arithmetic, about the older boy whose family needed him for ranch work, and who was therefore absent 2 days a week, about the way the classroom had begun to smell like chalk dust, and the particular combination of wool and sage that the children brought in on their clothes. He listened to all of it. He asked questions that were specific and showed he had actually retained what she had told him before. He told her about his day's work on the ranch in the same way, not complaining, not boasting, but simply reporting the facts of a day lived, which she found she looked forward to hearing in a way that she did not examine too closely in those first weeks. Their evenings fell into a pattern with the natural ease of a pattern that has been waiting to happen. She would cook supper while he did the last of the barn work. He would come in, they would eat, and afterward they would sit by the fire, she reading or working on lesson plans, he reading or mending tack or doing the quiet accounts of the ranch in a small ledger he kept meticulously. The dog, whose name was Porter, divided his time between them with diplomatic evenness. She noticed things about him gradually, the way you notice landscape when you are moving through it slowly rather than at a gallop. The way he always checked the horses last before coming to the house, running a hand over each neck. The way he kept her father's last letter, which she had given him, the one Thomas had written to him in those final months, not in a drawer but in the front of the book he was currently reading, so that it traveled with him through his days. The way his hands, which were a working man's hands and showed it, were nonetheless careful with everything they touched, careful with the horses, careful with the tack, careful with the coffee cups when he set them down. It was a Wednesday evening in June, about 5 weeks after her arrival, when something shifted between them in a way that was not precisely named but was clearly felt. She had been working on a letter to the Territorial Education Office about curriculum materials, and she had gotten frustrated with a particular sentence that refused to say what she meant it to say. She had said under her breath, something that was not a swear word but was the sort of word a woman raised with Thomas Bristol's propriety did not generally say aloud. And Micah, across the fire, had looked up from his ledger and caught the expression on her face, and he had quite suddenly and apparently despite himself laughed. It was not a polite laugh, and it was not a performative laugh. It was a real one, short and genuine, and it changed his face entirely, the way a door opens and changes the light in a room. She had not heard him laugh before, not like that, and she stared at him for a moment with more surprise than the moment warranted. "I am glad my frustration is entertaining," she said, with the exact dry tone that she knew was her best defense. "Not frustrating," he said, recovering himself, though the warmth of the laugh was still there in his expression. "The word you used, I have not heard that word from a schoolteacher before." "I was taught it by a cattle drover in Abilene," she said primly, and he laughed again, and she laughed too, and the sound of it in that small warm room was something neither of them quite knew what to do with, but neither of them was in a hurry to stop. After that evening, something in the air between them was different. Not uncomfortable, the opposite. Easier and at the same time more charged, the way the air gets before a summer storm when the electricity is building, and everything becomes very vivid. She found herself noticing when he came into a room. She found herself angling her conversation in the evenings toward subjects she had observed interested him, and then catching herself doing it and being both amused and honest enough to acknowledge why. She had been in love once before, briefly, in Abilene. A man named Crawford who had been charming and inconsistent in the way that charming men sometimes are, and it had not ended well, which had taught her to be careful with herself in this particular regard. But Micah Wells was not charming. Charming was not the right word for him at all. He was honest and steady and attentive, and occasionally, when his guard came down far enough, quietly funny in a way that caught her off guard every time. And there was something else, something she felt when he was near that was not like anything Crawford had produced, which was a kind of gravity, as if she was standing on more solid ground in his vicinity. She was a practical woman, however, and she had arrived under circumstances that complicated everything. She was living in his house. She was financially dependent on a salary the town council could revoke. She was a stranger in a settlement where she was only just beginning to be known. The last thing she needed, she told herself sensibly, was to be foolish about the man who had taken her in. So she was careful. She was warm but not forward. She was present without being intrusive. She paid her small rent on time and maintained the clear, clean lines of their arrangement. What she did not account for was the day in July when one of her students, a girl of 8 named Rosita Ruiz, Cal's granddaughter, as it turned out, which made the world small and lovely in the way the West had of doing that, took sick in the middle of the school day with a high fever. The child's parents were out at the ranch, 2 miles from town, and there was no way to get to them quickly. The doctor in Coldwater Creek, Doc Hartley, a capable man who was unfortunately also the only man in the settlement who could be relied upon to pull a tooth, set a bone, or diagnose a fever, was out on a call 12 miles east. Abigail closed the school, sent the other children home with her oldest pupil, a serious 14-year-old named James Schraber, and carried Rosita to the general store where she could lay her down. She sent someone to get Micah Wells, because he was the person she thought of first. He arrived in 15 minutes, having ridden rather than taken the wagon, and he came in and assessed the situation with the quick, unflappable practicality of a man who had handled emergencies before. He checked the child's forehead, asked Abigail a series of clear questions about when the fever had started, and whether the girl had complained of any pain, and then he said he was going to ride out to the child's parents himself, while Abigail kept the girl cool and calm. He was back with Rosita's mother, Maria, within the hour, having ridden hard in both directions, and the reunion between mother and daughter in the back room of the general store was the kind of thing that made the room feel both very small and very full. Maria Ruiz held her daughter and cried quietly and thanked Abigail in a mix of English and Spanish that needed no translation. Doc Hartley arrived late in the afternoon, diagnosed a simple fever with no serious complications, and the child was home and recovering by the following morning. But that evening back at the ranch, after the drama of the day had settled and the desert was quiet and the stars were coming out in their particular New Mexico extravagance, Abigail and Micah sat on the porch, which they had never done before, always choosing the indoors of an evening, and she looked at him and said without planning to, "Thank you for coming when I sent for you." "Of course," he said, as if it was not a thing that required thanks. "You did not have to come yourself. You could have sent word to the parents and let it be." He looked at her. The porch was in shadow, but the desert beyond was pale with starlight, and his face was visible in it. "You needed help," he said simply. "That is sufficient reason." She looked at him for a long moment. The air between them was warm and still and smelled of sage. "You are a very good man, Micah Wells," she said. Something moved across his face that was not quite embarrassment but was in the same family. He looked away toward the dark shape of the mountains to the north. "Your father thought so," he said, in a quiet voice that had a rough edge to it. "I have not always been certain he was right." She heard the war in that. She heard all the things that men who went to war came back carrying, the weight of which they did not generally speak of. She had heard it in her father's silences too, the way certain evenings would fall on him like a changed weather, and he would be somewhere far away in his own mind, and she would know not to call him back from it, only to be present until he returned on his own. "He was certain," she said. "My father was not a man who was wrong about people." He did not say anything. But after a moment he looked back at her, and in the look she saw something raw and real, and she thought carefully, clearly, with full awareness, that she was in considerable trouble when it came to Micah Wells. August arrived with a heat that was serious and total, the kind of heat that made the desert shimmer at its edges and turned the midday air into something almost solid. School went on reduced hours during the worst of it, mornings only, letting the children go home before the sun reached its peak. Abigail developed the desert dweller's habit of moving slowly during the heat of the day and saving the real work for early morning and evening. She and Micah fell into longer conversations as the evenings cooled and the stars appeared, and the porch became their habitual place to end the day. They talked about the war, carefully at first and then less so, because he trusted her enough by now to say things he had not said to many people, and she was a good enough listener to receive them without making him feel exhibited. They talked about the territory, its politics, which were complicated and often unjust, the land questions that still ran like a fault line through New Mexico, the way the older land grants and the newer claims sometimes collided in courts and outside them. They talked about the Comanche and Navajo and Apache peoples, and here Micah spoke with a clear-eyed acknowledgement of the injustices that had been and were still being done, the broken treaties, the displacement, the violence sanctioned by governments that called it policy. He had seen enough of it in his years in the territory to have opinions that were not popular among all his neighbors but were honest. "There is land enough," he said one evening, quietly. "The problem has never been the land. It has been who decides it belongs to whom." She agreed with him and told him so, and the agreement was not polite but genuine, and it meant something to both of them to find the agreement there. She had been corresponding with several of the families at the outlying ranches about getting their children into school more regularly, making arrangements for the families who could not manage the distance every day, a schedule, a boarding arrangement with families in town during the school week. It was a project that required a great deal of letter writing and persuasion, and one Sunday afternoon visit to a ranch east of Coldwater Creek, which Micah drove her to and waited patiently outside while she went in and made her case to a skeptical father who did not see the point of arithmetic for a child who was going to work cattle. She made the argument with a systematic clarity that impressed the skeptical father enough that he agreed to try it for a month And on the ride home, Micah said, without looking at her, "You should have been a lawyer." "Women cannot be lawyers," she said. "I know," he said. "It is a failure of the legal system." She looked at him. He said it with perfect seriousness. She felt something warm bloom in her chest that she gave up in that moment, trying not to feel. The first time he touched her, it was entirely accidental. They were in the barn on a September evening, because one of the horses had been favoring a foreleg all day, and he was checking it again before dark, and she had come to hold the lamp. She was standing close to hold the light where he needed it, and he straightened up from examining the leg and turned, and she had not moved, and they were very close, and his hand came up before he thought about it and caught her elbow to steady her as she shifted on the hay-covered ground. He held her elbow for perhaps 2 seconds. They were looking at each other from very close range. She could see the particular color of his eyes, which in the lamplight were dark and clear, and paying the kind of attention that she was unaccustomed to being the object of. He let go of her elbow. He stepped back. He said in a voice that was entirely level but required effort to make so, "The horse is fine. Just a bruise on the frog, it will resolve." "Good," she said, in a voice that was equally level and required equal effort. They walked back to the house in the dark and did not discuss it, and talked for an hour by the fire about subjects neither of them could have named the following morning, because neither of them was paying attention to the words, and both of them knew it. It was a Saturday in late September when the thing finally arrived at its honest destination, and it arrived the way honest things tend to, not with ceremony but with simplicity. She had been baking bread, which she had started doing on Saturday mornings because she enjoyed it, and the house smelled extraordinary for the entire rest of the day when she did. He had come in from the morning's work and poured himself coffee and sat at the table, and she had been talking about one of her students, James Schraber, the older boy, who had shown a remarkable aptitude for mathematics, and for whom she was trying to find more advanced material because he had already worked through everything the schoolhouse had to offer. "He is 14, she said, turning the bread dough, "and he can do arithmetic in his head that most grown men need paper for. He should go to a proper school, somewhere with real resources. I have been writing to the school in Santa Fe. They have an excellent academy, but the fees are beyond what his family can manage." "What would it cost?" Micah said. She told him. He was quiet for a moment. "That is not impossible," he said. She stopped working the dough and looked at him. "Micah, the Schrabers are good people. August is a fair man and has helped me more than once. If his boy has real ability, it is not your responsibility," she said. "I know," he said. "I am aware of that." He met her eyes. "I do not do everything because it is my responsibility." She looked at him for a long moment across the table, across the bread dough and the morning light and the coffee and all the ordinary objects of a life being shared, and she felt very clearly and completely what she felt, and she decided to stop pretending she did not feel it. "Micah," she said, and her voice was quiet and direct, because she was not a woman who dressed things up when the plain form would do better. "I want to tell you something, and I want to be honest about it." He looked at her with the full, steady attention he gave to everything that mattered. "I did not come here looking for anything except what my father intended, a safe harbor, a start. I did not expect to find," she paused, chose the word carefully. "I did not expect to find you, not the way I have." The room was very quiet. Somewhere outside, a mockingbird was running through its repertoire in one of the cottonwoods, and the bread dough was warm under her hands, and the morning light came through the window at a low angle and lay across the table in a warm bar. Micah Wells stood up from his chair. He moved around the table to where she stood, and he stopped close to her, not crowding, but close. And the way he was looking at her was not the careful look he usually offered the world, but something that had let its guard down entirely. "I have been wanting to say something to you for 2 months, he said, in a low voice, "and I have been unable to determine how to say it without making it complicated." "Say it plainly," she said. "I am a plain person." "You are the least plain person I have ever met," he said, and then, before she could respond to that, he said, I have been waiting to understand if what I feel is what I think it is, and I have concluded that it is, and that I am in considerable danger of being a complete fool about it if I do not say something." She laughed softly. He was looking at her with that unguarded look, and she put her flour-dusted hand on his chest and felt his heart beat under her palm with a speed that had nothing to do with exertion. "Say something," she said. "I love you," he said simply, without qualification. "I have been falling in that direction since the first night you sat at my table and told me about crossing 600 miles on a name, and I am entirely there now." She looked up at him. The mockingbird was still singing. The bread dough was sitting on the table. The morning was enormous and still around the small, warm room. "Good," she said, "because I love you, Micah Wells, and I have been considerably frustrated with myself about it for the past 2 months." He put his hands on her face, those careful hands, with their working man's roughness, and he kissed her, and it was the kind of kiss that settled a question permanently, the kind that answers everything it asks. She kissed him back with equal intention, and when they separated she was laughing again, quietly, with the particular joy of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has just put it down. "You have flour on you," she said, looking at the white handprint she had left on his shirt. He looked down at it. "I do," he agreed. He was smiling, the real one, the one she had first seen on that Wednesday evening in June and had been wanting to see again ever since. "I should finish the bread," she said. "You should," he agreed. He did not move immediately. Neither did she. They stood very close in the morning light, and it was perfectly fine that the bread had to wait another minute or two. He proposed to her 6 weeks later, on an October evening when the desert was beginning its autumn cooling, and the cottonwoods along the creek had gone gold and were dropping their leaves into the water in a slow, pale ceremony. He had clearly thought about it at some length, because he had arranged for the evening to have a specific quality to it. He had taken her riding in the late afternoon, to a part of the ranch that looked out over the valley toward the western mesas, where in the evening light the rock was burning orange and the shadows were long and blue, and the whole enormous country seemed to be performing at its absolute best. He had brought coffee in a tin pot wrapped in cloth to keep it warm, which struck her as a deeply characteristic gesture, practical and thoughtful at once, because he knew she would want coffee and had made sure there would be some. He said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that I am asking it as a free question, not as something owed or expected, not as an arrangement or a convenience. I am asking it because I want to build a life here with you more than I have wanted anything in a long time." She was looking at him over her coffee cup. "Ask," she said. "Will you marry me, Abigail Bristol?" She was quiet for one moment, not a hesitating moment but a feeling moment, the kind of pause a person takes when they want to be entirely inside the significance of something before they answer it. "Yes," she said. "With my whole heart, yes." He took her free hand and held it, and they sat on the hillside in the October light of New Mexico territory, while the mesas burned their evening colors, and it was so entirely right and entire that there was nothing to say that the moment had not already said. They were married in November by Reverend Acaffer in the small church with the crooked cross, on a Wednesday morning when the air was cold and clear, and the sky, above Coldwater Creek, was an improbable shade of blue that none of the guests would forget. The guests were the people of the settlement, the Schrabers, the Beaumonts, Cal Ruiz and his family, Abigail's students and their parents, Doc Hartley, the woman who ran the boarding house, several of the ranching families from the surrounding land, perhaps 60 people in a church that held 50 comfortably if everyone was friendly. Reverend Acaffer read from Corinthians and then from Ruth, because he said the story of Ruth, of following someone to an unfamiliar country, because the love was worth the uncertainty seemed particularly appropriate given the circumstances, and Abigail had stood at the front of the church beside Micah Wells, and felt the accuracy of it so completely that her eyes filled for a moment, though she kept them from spilling by the effort of will that was, by now, entirely characteristic. Micah was wearing his good coat, which was dark wool and fit him well, and he had made an effort with his hair, and he was looking at her with an expression she had not seen before, which was the expression of a man who cannot believe his luck and has decided to simply stand inside the miracle of it rather than question it. She wore her best dress, which was pale blue cotton, and her mother's silver comb in her hair, and she held a small bunch of dried flowers that Maria Ruiz had arranged for her, because real flowers in November in the high desert were not available, but dried ones could be made beautiful if you knew what you were doing. After the ceremony, there was a gathering at the Schraber's barn, which was the largest indoor space in the settlement, and there was food and music. Beaumont's son played guitar, and the Mexican families brought fiddles and played songs that had their feet moving whether they wanted them to or not. And it was an evening that everyone would refer to for years as one of the good ones, the kind of evening that becomes a reference point when people want to describe what a celebration looked like. Micah danced with her twice, and he was not an elegant dancer, but he was earnest and steady, and he kept hold of her hand through both dances with a grip that was not quite possessive, but was entirely sure. She danced with Schraber and Ruiz and Doc Hartley and several of the fathers of her students, and each time she came back to Micah, she saw him watching her with a quiet contentment that made her want to put her arms around him in front of everyone, which she did not do because there were children present and she maintained certain standards, but the want was genuine. They rode home to the ranch together through the cold November night, the horses moving at a walk because there was no hurry and the stars were extraordinary, and the desert was silver and still under them. She was riding the mare that Micah had acquired for her in September from a rancher to the north, a gentle bay that she had named Clara and had come to love unreasonably. They rode side by side, and he reached across the space between them and took her hand and held it for the whole 2 miles, and neither of them said very much because neither of them needed to. The house was warm when they got back, because Micah had banked the fire before they left, and it had held through the evening. Porter, the dog, was delighted to see them, and expressed this in his usual dignified way, which was to stand and wag once and then go back to his position by the fire. She changed out of her wedding dress carefully and folded it into the trunk, and she put the silver comb on the shelf beside the window, and Micah put more wood on the fire and made tea because it was very late and he thought coffee at this hour would keep them up when they were already tired from happiness. And they sat together in the firelight in the place that was now entirely, clearly, mutually their home, and the life they were beginning together felt as solid and real as the walls around them. The winter was cold but not brutal, and they were warm and busy in it. She continued teaching. The school was doing well, and enrollment was up because the outlying families had arranged the midweek boarding she had organized, and he worked the ranch through the cold months, mending, building, preparing. He was building an addition to the back of the house, 2 rooms, working on it on the weekends when the weather allowed. She asked him once why 2 rooms, with a specific attention in her voice, and he said that he was optimistic about the future, and she laughed and helped him carry lumber. In December, James Schraber received a letter of acceptance from the Santa Fe Academy with a scholarship. Micah had written to them. She found this out later from Schraber himself, who came to the ranch one evening to thank them both. He had written explaining the boys' situation and abilities and had offered a contribution to the scholarship fund, and between the two the academy had made it work. James Schraber would start in the new year, and the pride on his father's face when he talked about it was of the particular and intense variety that German men of a certain generation display when they are so moved they cannot quite look you in the eye. Abigail took Micah's hand that night after Schraber left, without saying anything about it, just took it and held it, and he looked at her and she looked at him, and the understanding between them was complete. She told him on a January evening, with the fire high and the wind outside pressing on the desert in long, mournful sweeps, that she was expecting a child. She told him simply and directly, because she was a direct person, but her voice had a softness in it that she did not usually employ. He was very still for a moment. Then he looked at her with the unguarded look, the one that had no careful distance in it, and she saw in it something that was not just happiness but was a specific, complete kind of joy that seemed to surprise him as much as it moved her. He said her name, just her name, Abigail, in a voice that was so quiet it was almost only breath. "Yes," she said, answering the question he had not asked, answering everything in the name. He crossed to her and put his arms around her carefully, as if she had become suddenly precious in a way that required more care than usual, and she laughed at the carefulness and said she was not made of glass, and he said he knew that better than anyone, and held on anyway. They spent the winter evenings talking about the future with the specific and joyful practicality of people who have agreed on a direction and are happy to plan. Names were discussed. He liked strong names, names with weight to them. She liked names that meant something, that came from somewhere. They talked about the addition, which he was determined to have complete before the summer. They talked about the school, which she planned to continue as long as she was able and then arrange for a substitute until she could return. They talked about her father, often, in the way that people talk about the dead who were beloved not with grief, but with the easy love of those who are missed and remembered. One evening she said, "He would have loved this. He would have sat there," she pointed to the chair across the fire, "and he would have asked you questions about the cattle and the soil and the water rights, and he would have been entirely impossible about letting the answers come at a normal pace, because he always wanted to know 3 steps ahead of wherever the conversation was." Micah smiled. "He was like that in the war too, always thinking ahead, always asking about the next position before we were through with the current one." He paused. "It was what kept us alive more than once." "That is exactly it," she said. "He thought ahead." She looked at the fire. "He thought ahead to you." "I know," Micah said. "I am grateful for it every day." She looked at him. "So am I." Spring came to Coldwater Creek in the manner of a revelation, the cottonwoods greening almost overnight, the creek running high with snowmelt from the mountains to the north, the desert blooming in brief, fierce explosions of purple and yellow and red that seemed almost argumentative in their beauty, as if the plants needed to make a point about what was possible in seemingly inhospitable ground. The addition to the house was finished in March, 2 rooms, clean and well-built, one of which she immediately converted into a proper classroom space for small tutoring sessions and the overflow work she brought home from school. The other was arranged as a nursery, and she made it warm and good, with a crib that Schraber had built as a wedding gift, placed near a window that looked out toward the creek and the cottonwoods. There was a moment in April when she stood in the doorway of that small room, her hand on the door frame, the afternoon light coming through the window and laying gold across the crib and the braided rug and the small shelf of picture books she had arranged, and she felt so fully and completely fortunate that it was almost alarming. She was not a person who had taken good fortune for granted because she had not had an excess of it in her life, but this particular room in this particular house, with the creek sounds coming through the window and the knowledge of everything that had brought her here, felt like a gift of such specific generosity that she wanted to find the right words to acknowledge it. Micah came up behind her. He did not announce himself. He never did, she had noticed. He simply arrived quietly. He stood beside her in the doorway and looked at the room. "It is good," he said. "It is very good," she agreed. He put his arm around her shoulders. She leaned slightly into him. They stood there in the April afternoon looking at the room that was waiting, and neither of them felt the need to say anything further. Their son was born in late July, in the heat of the New Mexico summer, delivered by Doc Hartley with the assistance of Maria Ruiz, who had acquired somewhere in her life the calm efficiency of a natural midwife. The birth was not easy and it was not quick, but Abigail Bristol was, as had been established, not a woman of fragile constitution, and she arrived on the other side of it with a healthy, loud, thoroughly indignant baby boy in her arms, and a face that showed the evidence of what she had been through, but also, clearly and unmistakably, the particular light that some faces have when they have just done something extraordinary. Micah was allowed in after, and he sat beside the bed and held his son with the careful gravity of a man who has understood completely that holding this child is the most important thing he has ever done, and he looked at Abigail over the baby's head with an expression she filed away in the deepest part of her memory to keep there forever. They named him Thomas Micah Wells, Thomas for his grandfather, who had been the architect of everything, in his quiet, far-thinking way. Micah for the father who would not waste a word when a single look would do, but who had turned out to have more to say than she had expected and more love to give than she had dared hope. Reverend Abigail christened the baby the following Sunday with the formal dignity and private warmth that characterized everything he did, and the congregation of the Coldwater Creek church filled the small building past its comfortable capacity and then some, because by now Abigail Wells, as she was known in the settlement, though she kept Bristol at the school, because the children had known her by that name, and it seemed important, was a person people felt genuine affection for. She had taught their children. She had organized the boarding arrangement that kept families connected. She had written letters on their behalf to territorial offices and supply companies. She was known. And Micah Wells, who had been respected in the settlement for years before she arrived, had become, in the eyes of their neighbors, somehow more fully himself since she had come. There was a general and unspoken consensus among the people of Coldwater Creek that the pair of them were one of those matches that appear to have been constructed with unusual care, the kind that make everyone around them feel slightly more optimistic about the general condition of things. Cal Ruiz at the christening party pulled Abigail aside for a moment and said, in his characteristically direct way, "You know I told you he was a fair man, a kind man sometimes." "You did," she said. "I was wrong," he said. She looked at him, startled. "I was wrong about the sometimes," he said. "I have been watching him since you came, and it is not sometimes. It is constant. He has always been this way. He just needed someone to see it." He looked at her with the directness of a man who has earned the right to say things plainly. "You came all that way on a name. It was the right name." She held her son against her shoulder, this son who carried her father's name and her husband's, and she looked at Cal Ruiz and felt the truth of it settle into her like water into desert soil completely, immediately, without the possibility of anything other than absorption. "Yes," she said. "It was." The years that followed built themselves in the way that the best years do, not dramatically, but with the steady accumulation of a life being lived richly. The school grew. She added a second teacher in the fall of 1875, a young man named Harrison from Ohio who was idealistic and eager, and who she trained with the same direct care she gave her students. The enrollment was up to 22 children. There were families now moving to the settlement partly because there was a proper school, which she took a quiet but genuine pride in. Micah's ranch grew too, gradually, carefully, with the same unhurried attention he gave to everything. He added land, acquired more cattle, hired a hand named Ernesto who was 20 years old and from the settlement to the south, and who quickly became indispensable, and whom they ended up feeding as often at their table as not, because he was young and the food was good, and it seemed unkind to let a person that young eat alone every night. In the spring of 1876, Abigail discovered she was expecting again. She told Micah in the same way she had told him the first time, directly in the evening by the fire, and he looked at her with the same unguarded joy, and she thought that was one of the specific gifts of having chosen well, that the same things remained good. That repetition did not diminish them. Their second child was another boy, born in December 1876, whom they named after no one in particular, simply a name they both liked, Daniel, which had a weight to it and a long history and felt right in the mouth. Thomas Wells, at 17 months, was profoundly suspicious of his brother for approximately 3 days, and then became, with the pragmatic adaptability of very young children, his fiercest ally. The two of them together in the same space produced a quantity of noise and energy that made Porter, the dog, look at Abigail with what she could only interpret as a request for some form of compensation. And then, 2 years after Daniel, in the autumn of 1879, a girl. They had not specifically expected a girl, had not particularly hoped for one over another boy. But when she arrived with such clear specificity, dark hair and blue-gray eyes, and a temperament from the very beginning that combined Abigail's directness with Micah's steadiness, in a combination that neither of them could look at without smiling, that the name felt immediately obvious. They called her Clara, for the bay mare who had carried Abigail faithfully for years, before being given to the most gentle of the neighboring ranch families when she grew too old for the hills. The mare had been a good companion, and the name was beautiful, and it suited the child from the first morning of her life. By 1880, the house had been extended again, a second edition, the 3 children needing their own space and Micah needing a proper room for the ranch accounts, which had grown complex enough to justify a dedicated surface. The shelf of books had expanded along both walls of the main room. The kitchen had been updated with a better stove. The porch ran the full length of the front now, wide enough for 2 chairs and a third when Ernesto came to sit with them in the evenings, which happened often enough that his chair was simply permanently there. James Schraber came back from the Santa Fe Academy in 1878, 20 years old, and equipped with more mathematics than Coldwater Creek had ever needed, but quietly grateful for every bit of it. And he started working as an assistant to the territorial surveyor, which was exactly the right work for a mind like his. He came to dinner at the Wells Ranch one Sunday in September of that year, and he sat across from Micah and said, with the careful directness of a young man who has thought about how to say a thing properly, "I know you were behind the scholarship. My father told me. I want to say that it changed everything for me." Micah looked at him. "You earned the scholarship," he said. "I only made sure the right people were aware that it was there to be earned." James looked at Abigail, who was serving food and had been listening to this exchange with considerable affection. She gave him the look she gave her students when the lesson had landed correctly. He smiled. In the winter of 1880, Reverend Acaffer announced that he was retiring. He was 67 and his health required it. He told the congregation on a Sunday morning in November with the same quiet dignity with which he did everything. And there was a grief in the church that was specific and real, because he had been a constant of the settlement for many years, and had married people and buried people, and christened their children, and been present at the edges of nearly every significant moment in the life of the community. At the gathering afterward at the Beaumont's house, he found Abigail and Micah together. They were usually together at these things, though not in an exclusive way. They moved through the room like 2 people who are grounded to each other and therefore free to move, and he took both their hands and held them, one in each of his old hands, and he said, "You 2 have been one of the great pleasures of my time here. That is all. I simply wanted to say it." Abigail pressed his hand. Micah, who did not generally make speeches, said simply, "You married us well, Reverend. Thank you for that." The old man smiled. "I have married a number of people in my years," he said, "and I have found that the ones who are truly suited do not require much from the ceremony. They arrive already decided. You were like that." He looked at them with the warm clarity of a man who has seen a great deal and understood much of it. "She crossed a very long distance on nothing more than your name," he said to Micah. "I have always thought that was a remarkable thing." Micah looked at Abigail. She looked at him. The look was one that had been looked between them 1,000 times by now and still landed with the same specific warmth. "It was," Micah said, "and she was worth every mile of coming to find. The territory owed her that much at least." She shook her head at him, but she was smiling. "The territory owed me nothing," she said. "Everything it had to offer I found." The children grew. Thomas grew into a serious, capable boy who loved the ranch with a particular and specific passion, following his father everywhere, absorbing everything Micah taught him with an attentiveness that sometimes made Abigail catch her breath with its resemblance to someone else. His grandfather, Thomas Bristol, who had taught her the world with the same patient, specific care. She would watch her eldest son standing beside his father, looking at the land or the cattle or the mountains to the north with those thoughtful eyes, and she would feel the long thread of continuity that ran from her father through her and into this child, and it was one of the most peaceful feelings she had ever known. Daniel grew into his own very different shape, louder, quicker to laugh, with a social ease that was not quite like either parent and was entirely his own. He was the one who knew everyone in Coldwater Creek by name, who could tell you exactly what was happening with every family in the settlement, who brought home friends with a careless abundance that kept the Wells table fuller and noisier than it might otherwise have been. Abigail had decided she was glad of the noise. Clara, at 5 and then 6, was the one who most alarmed and delighted her parents in equal measure, because she had inherited enough of both of them to be extremely determined and extremely clear-eyed and extremely unwilling to accept any answer that she had not personally verified. She argued with her brothers relentlessly, and one more often than either of them cared to admit. She followed Abigail to school some mornings and sat in the back of the classroom with the focused attention of someone who has decided to learn everything available and has made a preliminary plan. "She is going to be a teacher," Abigail told Micah one evening. "She is going to be whatever she decides to be," Micah said, "and it will take a considerable amount of effort to redirect her once she has decided." "She gets that from you," Abigail said. He looked at her with the expression that she had been the recipient of for 7 years now, and that still produced in her an unreasonable and entirely genuine warmth. "Does she?" "The stubbornness," she said, "absolutely. And the confidence." "That," she said, "she gets from me." He laughed. The real laugh, the one that changed his face and still, after all this time, made her feel that she had done something right. She had loved that laugh since June of 1873, had been collecting instances of it the way some people collect significant rocks or pressed flowers, keeping them in the inventory of the most valuable things. In the spring of 1882, they rode out together, just the two of them, on a Saturday when Ernesto had agreed to watch the children, to the hillside on the north end of the ranch where Micah had proposed to her 12 years before. The Mesas were doing what they always did in the spring evening, burning their colors with a theatrical commitment that never became less effective no matter how many times she had witnessed it. He had brought coffee, in the same kind of tin pot wrapped in cloth, because he was a man of consistent thoughtfulness, and because some traditions are too good to stop. They sat on the same hillside, drinking their coffee, and the territory spread around them in its enormous, patient way, the creek glittering in the low light, the cottonwoods green and moving, the mountains holding the last of the snow on their high shoulders, the desert running in every direction with its sage and its silence and its miles and miles of honest, beautiful, demanding truth. "Do you miss Kansas?" he asked her. She thought about it genuinely, because she was a person who thought about questions genuinely. "I miss the way the sky looked in May," she said. "That particular green light before a storm. You do not get that here." "No," he agreed. "But I do not miss Kansas," she said. "I miss a specific quality of light. Kansas itself, no." She looked at the mesas. "I am here." "You are here," he said. "I cannot imagine being anywhere else," she said, which was the absolute truth. "I crossed the entire territory on nothing but your name. Everything that came after was what the journey was for." He reached across and took her hand the way he had done on their wedding night, riding home through the cold and the stars, with the ease of a man for whom holding that hand was the most natural motion available to him. "I have been thinking," he said, "about Thomas is 13. He knows the ranch well. In a few years he could take on more real responsibility. He was looking at the mountains. There is more land to the north that has been up for claim. I have been considering it, expanding." He paused. I wanted to talk to you about it before I did anything." She looked at him. He always did this, brought the large decisions to the table between them before they were decisions, when they were still considerations, because they had early established between themselves the clear and working principle that the ranch was theirs together, and the life was theirs together, and the decisions were therefore not individual. It was one of the things she loved most about the structure of their life, the way it was genuinely shared, not divided into domains but built jointly every day with the honest contribution of both of them. "How much more land?" she asked. He told her. They talked about it, the cost, the labor it would require, the timeline, the risk, and the potential. They talked about it the way they talked about everything, with directness and specificity and the freedom of two people who trust each other's judgment, and are not afraid of disagreement because disagreement between them had always been, in the end, productive. They decided together, on the hillside with the coffee cooling in the pot, in the spring evening light of New Mexico Territory in 1882, to expand the ranch. And they did expand it over the following years, with Thomas increasingly at his father's side, learning everything and Daniel helping in his bright and sociable way, and Clara opinionating from her position as the youngest and clearest-thinking person in any room she occupied. There came a day in the winter of 1884, just before Christmas, when Abigail was sitting at the desk in the small room she used for her school preparation. She still taught, though the school was now large enough to have 3 teachers, and she was more administrator than classroom teacher, though she kept 2 classes for herself because she was not willing to give it all up, and she was reading a letter. The letter was from a woman in Missouri whose father had died recently, leaving her with very little and a name, the name of a woman in New Mexico Territory, given to her by a neighbor who had once heard someone mention that Abigail Wells of Coldwater Creek was a woman who had done the same thing once, who had crossed a long distance on a name, and that if anyone knew how to land somewhere new and start again, she might. The woman's name was Eliza Marsh. She was 26 years old. She had 2 children, ages 3 and 5. Her husband had left 2 years before and no one knew where he had gone. She had some teaching experience and was willing to work. Abigail read the letter twice. Then she went to find Micah. He was in the barn with Thomas going over something with the horses. She waited in the barn doorway until there was a pause in their work, and then she handed him the letter without saying anything. He read it. Thomas looked at him and then at his mother with the particular alertness of a 13-year-old who has learned to read the room. Micah looked up from the letter. His expression was entirely predictable to her after all this time. It was the quiet, unhurried certainty of a man who has already arrived at his answer. "Right back," he said. "We do not have room," she said. "The house is full." "We have room," he said. "We always find room." He handed the letter back to her. "She has teaching experience and there is a position opening at the school when Harrison leaves in the spring for his father's business in Albuquerque." "You think of everything," she said. "I think of some things," he said. "You think of the rest." The corner of his mouth moved. "Between us we manage." She wrote to Eliza Marsh that evening. She wrote a letter that was warm and specific and entirely honest, describing the town, the conditions, the school, what she could offer and what she could not, what the territory was like, what a person needed to survive it and to love it, which were sometimes the same things. She described the creek and the cottonwoods and the way the sky looked at night. She described the school and the children and the community. She described her husband without describing too much, because some things were private, but she wrote enough that a perceptive woman would understand that the man was good and the situation was safe. She sent the letter, and 6 weeks later Eliza Marsh wrote back to say she was coming, and that she was grateful in a way she did not have words for, and that she was bringing the name and the letter and whatever was left of her courage. Abigail wrote back, "Courage and a name are more than enough. This territory and these people will do the rest. Come." She put down her pen and looked out the window of her small desk room toward the creek and the cottonwoods and the enormous, patient, burning sky of New Mexico. And she felt the world arranging itself in the particular way that it did when things were turning in the right direction. Not easily, never easily, but truly. Micah appeared in the doorway behind her. He had a habit of checking on her in the evenings when the house was quiet, a habit she had never asked him to develop but which she would have missed acutely if he ever stopped. He looked at the letter on her desk and then at her face, reading both with equal accuracy. "She is coming," he said. "She is coming," Abigail said. He came into the room and put his hands on her shoulders, and she leaned back slightly against him, and they looked out the window together at the desert evening, the first stars appearing over the eastern ridge, the creek sound rising in the cooling air. "Good," he said. She put her hand over one of his on her shoulder. The room was warm, and the children were in various states of the business of living elsewhere in the house. She could hear Daniel saying something in a carrying voice, and Thomas's quieter response, and Clara's decisive interjection, and Porter, old and silver-muzzled now, moving slowly from room to room, keeping track of everyone, because that was his position and he had never wavered in it. "Micah," he said, "I crossed the entire territory on your name." "I know," he said. "I will never stop being glad that you did." She looked out at the stars. "It was worth every mile," she said, "every single mile." His hands tightened on her shoulders gently. Outside, the desert held its enormous, ancient, generous silence, and the creek moved over its stones, and the cottonwoods stood in their old faithful row, and the sky above Coldwater Creek went on filling with stars the way it had always done, and would keep doing, indifferent to the small particular loves lived out beneath it, and yet somehow, by its vast and blazing presence, seeming to confirm that they were real, and that they mattered, and that they were, against all odds and all the miles and all the names taken on faith, entirely, completely, wholly worth it. Thomas found them there a few minutes later, tall, 13, with his grandfather's eyes and his father's quiet, and he stood in the doorway and looked at the two of them and said, with the practical directness that came from being raised by people who communicated plainly, "Supper's ready." "We will be right there," Abigail said. He went back to the kitchen, and they could hear Clara taking credit for the cornbread in terms that suggested the credit was entirely warranted, and Daniel disputing this with the energy of someone who had stirred the beans and felt this was insufficiently acknowledged, and the warm noise of the house at supper time wrapped itself around everything like something built to last. Micah offered her his hand. She took it. They walked from the small room into the lit warmth of the house that they had built together, toward the table where their children were sitting in the unruly, vital, irreplaceable fact of themselves, and the door to the desert evening closed behind them, leaving the stars to their patient work and the creek to its endless, faithful moving, and the territory to the long business of becoming, which was the only business it had ever been in. It was a good life. It was a whole life. It was the life that a name had opened and that love had built, and it was going to keep building, one ordinary, extraordinary day at a time, for as long as there was sky above Coldwater Creek and people underneath it willing to cross the distance to find what was worth finding. And Abigail Bristol Wells had crossed every mile of it and would, without a single hesitation, cross it all again.